Okay, and we're live. Welcome to Horror Score. We're your hosts, Jesse and
Vanessa.
And this week's episode is
Tales from the Hood.
Now we don't have the movie. We don't own it.
Which is a crime. We should.
It is nowhere. It is currently not for sale. We even went to secondhand stores looking through used DVDs to buy this. Couldn't find it. So where did we find this eventually to watch it legally?
I have a Stars. I have the Stars expansion on Hulu just so I could watch Young Frankenstein, and then it ended up being on there as well.
So we almost had to postpone this episode, but here we are.
I needed it to happen though, because this is my childhood nostalgia movie. We grew up in different decades.
So one of your favorite movies from your childhood is an anthology. This
Yes.
movie's an anthology. It's 5 short
Oh,
tales.
it's 4.
There's an overarching story.
Okay,
That
I'm gonna call
counts.
that 4.
I'm calling it 5.
Call it 4. Comment below and tell me.
All right, fine. Comment below. Is the overarching story in an anthology? That's the story that happens in between all the segments. Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, has a really good one. Does that count as one of the stories?
Oh, Debbie Harry's in that.
Yeah, it's a good movie. We have the record. I have the record right here. It's fantastic. Where was I? This is an anthology.
Yes, it is.
What is your favorite anthology horror movie?
After watching this again, I definitely think this is my favorite horror anthology.
Oh.
I would say a close second is the Danny story from Twilight Zone, the movie.
Okay, yep.
The little boy who this woman runs over his bike, and she feels really bad, so she gives him a ride home and starts to realize that things are not cool in the house. And that short haunted me for a long time, but the stories in this definitely, every one of them, I think 3 out of 4 of them haunted me in my childhood.
I assure you that will not be the last time that Twilight Zone, the movie, is brought up in this episode. So for me, I guess my favorite anthology horror movie of all time it's tough, but I would say is Creepshow. Yeah, Creepshow. It's great. And I think Creepshow 2 could get there if it had another episode.
Well, they've already filmed it, so they can.
I love 2 of the 3 stories in that anthology, and I think if it had just one more solid story, but you only get the 3, and the overarching story it's really short, and it's like a cartoon. Right. But anyway, let's get to Tales from the Hood. That's why we're here, right? So we rate movies here on Horror Score on a 20-point scale over 5 categories for an impossible grand total of 100 points.
Sounds like lame.
So we're going to get into the story now, where 3 guys, Bulldog, Stack, and Ball, show up at Sim's funeral home to buy a shipment of what they only describe as
the shit.
And Mr. Sims tells them some tales of terror as he leads them deeper into the funeral home. So take it away, Vanessa.
I think that sums it up pretty nicely. Yeah, they're 4 fable-type stories that he tells them about black issues. It's basically an entirely black cast except for some white slave owners and police officers. But I was surprised, because I hadn't seen it in so long, how well written all of the stories were. They were really tight and great, and they all played off each other really well. It was kind of eerie, like watching something from 1995 in the year 2020 and having it still be so relevant.
Yeah, I think if Tales from the Hood came out today in theaters, people would be like, oh, yeah, I mean, this is all relevant issues right now.
And, maybe that's why they're delving back into it, making the part 3. Makes a lot of sense now.
It's true. Comes out this year, 2020.
So, yeah, I gave it a 14 because of how well written everything was. And even the frame story worked really well with the stories inside of it as well. So, yeah, 14.
I gave it a 13, and one of the things that's cool about this movie is I know people who don't really like horror movies, who are like, Oh, I love Tales from the Hood. Like, I used to watch that all the time as a kid, just because the stories are so different and they're fun, each in their own way. And sometimes you get some really good practical effects or monsters when you weren't quite expecting them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I gave it a 13. Now, I guess I'll take us into villain. And what's also interesting about this movie is
It's hard to pin down the villain.
each story has their own villain, so it makes an anthology kind of hard to score. But what's neat about this movie is most of the monsters usually aren't the villain. So, like in the first movie, we have a undead revenant going after the people who killed him. But he's not. He's a monster, but he's not the villain. The villain is the evil, corrupt police officers.
The people who made him that way, yeah.
And in the third story, we have this racist politician Duke, and the monsters are these evil puppets. But he's the villain. But each villain in, I think, 3 of the 4 segments were excellent. So I did give 13 points to the villains in this category.
Depending on who you're talking about in this, if you're talking about the creepy host, basically the funeral
a lot of points
director,
came from him.
just really, I remember so much as a child, and it was right when I rewatched it, just the sweating. He was just, there's something
Drenched.
so off-putting about like just a man who's constantly dripping sweat, and he has this wonderful gap in his teeth. Just really memorable. But this is a horror movie where it's really fun to root for the bad guy, like for reasons like you said. It's a lot of like revenge and that kind of thing. So I gave it 14 points for just, they were all very different types of villains throughout the story. And
I did like Mr. Sims a lot. Mr. Sims is, I think he's a great host. In every like anthology, like needs a good host. I love the Crypt Keeper. And the Sims character, I don't know if it's supposed to be the exact same character, but he returns in Tales from the Hood 2, but it's a different actor. Keith David plays him, who does tons of awesome work. He's Goliath in Gargoyles, and he was in The Thing as Childs. But I guess he's coming back in the third one. And do you have any guesses as to who is playing Sims in part 3?
Jordan Peele.
Tony Todd.
What?
Well, all right, I'm guessing it's Tony Todd.
Also, I think Jordan Peele would do a wonderful Mr. Sims.
Yes. There is a good video of him sweating in one of their shorts where he's got sweat pouring off of him, and that actually reminded me of Tales from the Hood, in like how by the time they get to like the lower levels of the funeral home, how bad they're
Tales
sweating.
from the Hood 3 is already 1 point for cameo and S Factor for me.
Now, I am just assuming that Tony Todd is Mr. Sims because he has the top billing, and that's where, like...
And he was sweating.
On part 1, it was like top billing was Mr. Sims, and on part 2, same thing. So they haven't released who he's playing yet, but I'm assuming he is the storyteller. So this was a long little chunk. Let's move on to the next thing so we can get this movie scored properly.
Horror. So this movie is horrifying. I'm glad that the shorts are so short, because I don't know if I could stay in any of those stories for any longer than I already was. The puppets.
I love the puppets.
I remembered that scene perfectly and exactly because I had so many nightmares about it when I was a child. And, just child abuse. A big, like, scary monster. A man gets twisted into, like, a pretzel, basically.
I love that part. It's David Alan Grier.
The police brutality is really, really hard to watch. It just feels very real. So I gave horror 13 points.
I gave horror 12 points because the music pushed how scary it was, and I know that normally that belongs in the next category, but the music itself was so scary. And as a kid, Twilight Zone the movie had very similar, evil, scary violin music. And I always thought as a teenager that the person who did the music for Tales from the Hood copied it. But it turns out it's the same guy. It's Christopher Young, so I guess he was just stealing from himself. And it works in both, and I absolutely loved it. So 12 points for me in the horror category, and I think 3 of the 4 stories do a good job delivering different bouts of horror. So this takes us into category number 4, effects. And again, for the similar reasons as before, I gave it a 13. And what I really loved is that CGI was starting to become more and more used in horror movies, and this movie took the time to continue still using stop motion animation and practical effects, which they did a good job at. There's like a melting face,
the time lapse.
The time lapse. The all of the puppets are all stop motion animation. They could have cut a lot of corners and just done one good CGI puppet and then copied it a bunch of times, but they didn't. The ending, the very end of the movie, there's some bad CGI, and I was so pleased all the way through the movie, and we get to the end and I was like, I forgot how bad that looked. So there is a little bit of bad CGI in the last 60 seconds of the movie, but it gets 13 points from me overall. What about you?
Well, this is where I put the scary score points myself, is because, again, that violin, especially in the puppet segment, there's a scene where a man is at the top of the staircase and there's a puppet there, and you just hear 2 violin strings and you're like, no.
Yeah, it's so like raw and grating.
Right, but there is so much blood in this movie. In every single segment, they use an exorbitant amount of blood, and so I always appreciate that. They were just throwing buckets, and yeah.
And in the 4th story, which was my least favorite of the bunch, the blood is so real. I remember being like, oh my god, that blood is so good. It was like some of that like almost black blood with red highlights.
Like pus in it. And
it was, chunks of things, like parts of someone's brain.
So it got 14 points from me for that level of blood and music.
So we're doing well so far. Let's see how we do in the final category. Vanessa, would you please take us into the S Factor, which is our final category where we can award up to 20 points for whatever reasons we want to.
Well, for me, this is where I put my nostalgia points.
Okay.
It got 14 points for managing to stay in my nightmares for years. I think I originally watched this because I had really bad insomnia when I was a child. And I would just be up until 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. And that's when I think this was on TV. It was at like 1 or 2 a.m. And so it was just always... it was always on, and then I would fall asleep shortly after it would end. And yeah, I remember, just in recent years too, having nightmares about the puppets or about the music or about the monster in the child abuse one. That was a really tense segment.
Yeah, awkward for everybody.
Yeah.
The this final category for me, assuming there's 5 stories, not 4, counting the overarching story, 4 of the 5 I really liked. So that's 4 points. There's a tiny bit of nudity, so there's 1 more point. And this is my 5th favorite anthology horror movie of all time for 5 more points for a grand total of 10 S Factor points.
So you gave it 5 points for it being your 5th favorite. So if it was your 20th favorite, it would get 20 points. And if it was your first favorite, it would only get 1.
In this case, it is a coincidence. But as it is S Factor, as I just mentioned, we can award the points however we want.
Just clarifying for the people.
Yeah, it's a good point. But it's a coincidence in this part. So, before we get to our final scores, we're going to turn to Vanessa's 1-sentence synopsis on the 1995 Tales from the Hood.
3 armed drug dealers go to a funeral home to retrieve the shit and patiently wait for a sweaty, scary man to tell them 4 stories.
So there you have it. That leaves me with a grand total of 61 horror score points for Tales from the Hood.
And I gave it 69.
And we, this time, our scores are pretty close. Like, we both really liked it. And it falls pretty close to IMDb. They give it a 6.3, which is basically a 63 of the way that they do things, but they just put a point in there. And the audience on Rotten Tomatoes gave it a 68% fresh. So...
And our combined total was 65.
Yeah. So we're like right in line with all those. We agree with most of the world on Tales from the Hood. So thank you for watching this episode of Horror Score. We'll be back next week with another episode. Give us 10 or 15 minutes and we might save you 2 hours.
Stay spooky.